to be considered. 7.1, Notice of Motion, Councillor Oke, Owners Corporations and Related Legislation. I now call on Paul Salter, President of the Victorian Industry Association, who requested the opportunity to address the committee in relation to this matter, to speak for no more than 3 minutes. Please, Paul, would you go to the microphone?
Thank you, Deputy Lord Mayor and councillors. I just request one point of clarification in relation to this motion before I speak to my submission, and that was the motion talks about the short-term accommodation industry. It makes reference to the Consumer Affairs Minister's recent bill that was in Parliament, and yet 3.3 goes totally into a totally different area and talks about rooming houses. And I just wanted you to clarify whether I'm confused, or is that particular area supposed to be there?
It's kind of, I'm not sure if this is a proper process, but that's kind of the point of the motion, is that while the review is going on, and I can talk to this when I present it, but while there's a review around, you know, amenity issues with regard to the short stay apartment, there's an opportunity that's potentially being missed through these other legislation around buildings, and that could be also addressed. Sorry, so it's the point of it. It's not just about short stay. This motion. Okay,
that's clarified. Just by way of summary before I make the final comment, is that the Minister acknowledged that the majority of short stay accommodation is used responsibly in Victoria. She talked about the fact that the industry contributes $792 million in revenue to Victoria, $160 million in wages, and I don't want to go through that, and 64,000 jobs in Victoria. She talked about the isolated incidents of party pads and unruly behaviour, and I think that goes a long way to probably justify that self-regulation is working effectively in that industry. I believe the most effective method to influence change as far as the Council is concerned in relation to amenity and bad behaviour would in fact be to ensure that the parties involved, such as the Victorian Accommodation Industry Association and the Strata Communities Association, that they actually work collaboratively to self-regulate and protect the interests of the owners and the residents in those buildings for the long term, rather than bring in more regulation. And I'm happy to speak to that, but if there's any other questions, that's basically what I wanted to say. The rest is in the submission.
Thank you, Paul. Is there a question? Yes,
Councillor Oke.
Mr. Salter, you were attending the meeting we had in Docklands not so long ago, where this matter was discussed, and Councillor Oke, myself, Councillor Foster and Councillor Watts was. The issue of short stay apartments, now it's been happening short stay apartments have been happening around the city. Some of them are officially called service apartments now. You run a number of them. I think the issue the council constantly gets representation on is how, as you mentioned, there are some short stay accommodation in some apartment blocks that are poorly managed, which results in the council having to look at this and through the building codes, to the building VBA. It's gone to VCAT, it's going to come back, and the reality is this: if self-management of the industry by the various authorities or the various bodies, representative bodies, needs to also bring the OCs close together, so that there's a clear understanding of coexistence. Plus, all you need is 1 or 2 or 3 bad practices to create a problem for everyone. So my question to you is, how can that be achieved in terms of your submission, that by self-regulation of the Vic AIA and the Strata Communities Associations, but not including the OCs?
Well, the Strata Communities Association represents all the OCs. So what I'm suggesting is that those two bodies together would in fact solve the issue. I'm not talking about doing it independently. The Strata Communities Association represents owners' corporations throughout Australia. So what I'm suggesting is both of those parties together address the issue.
I guess the question boils down to, if I drill down further, does the Strata Communities Association, or is it able to bring together all the individual OCs that are facing this? Because not every OCs face this issue. That's the problem.
Correct.
So how do we bring that into this discussion so that we, moving forward, you and other operators don't constantly face this sort of issues from whether the City of Melbourne or City of Port Phillip and other councils?
In answer to that question, I think the most important thing to understand here is that our livelihood is affected by unruly operators, and it's in our interest to see that those unruly operators are in some way stopped from what they're doing. The legislation that's been brought in goes a long way to addressing that issue and probably keeping people that are going to do the wrong thing out of the industry. But in terms of what we could do is, as those two, I'm talking about the owners' corporations and the association, working together and report to you on a regular basis of, one, what we're doing in relation to addressing problems. If you receive a problem, we should be made aware of it and give us the responsibility of either affecting those people, closing them down. And I can assure you the most effective way to stop a rogue operator is to take his business off the websites, and he will disappear. So there are solutions, and I think that's the sort of solution that would be way more effective than taking the other confrontational litigation type approach, which can be expensive and is not going to resolve the problem.
I conclude there. Thank you very much. We do have another speaker, and it is Marshall Delvis, the Director of We Live Here movement. 3 minutes, please.
Acting Lord Mayor, Councillors, I thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight. The We Live Here movement was formed in December 14, 2015, and in a short period of time we are now an advocate for over 120 buildings in and around Melbourne, not CBD, not South Bank, not Docklands, but all through Melbourne. And it's all about people having their voice heard, and it's all been brought about by the operation of service departments and Airbnb. My position as the Director of We Live Here, I'm also a committee member, an owner-occupier of a lot in Docklands, and I'm also the building manager of Watergate Apartments, so I can speak firsthand in regard to the behaviour of short stays. And it's interesting to hear about people who can self-regulate. I, for one, can guarantee you that self-regulation doesn't work. A lot of times the operator is the main offender, won't follow simple building rules, won't agree to the position of the building manager, what's best for the building, disable access. Most buildings in Melbourne don't have disabled access. They don't have the ability to be able to advise the MFB if they have disabled people in the building. So it all comes back to being able to understand what the building can do and can't do. We certainly like to thank Councillor Oke for putting this motion up. We fully support it. The We Live Here movement fully supports the motion, and I think that the government should go further in their determination. We support the 30-day minimum stay in any residential building. Residential buildings are not designed for short stays. At Watergate we have 6 entrances, and the early notification about a service department operator in our building is above a Indian grocer that says whatever the apartment or operator is. And that's how people find, because quite often I get calls in the office regarding where do I go to book in. There's no concierge, there's no one there. And I think a lot of buildings around Melbourne that have contacted us in this regard have exactly the same problems. And I've spoken to a number of councillors privately, as well as the Lord Mayor, and most of them agree, all are in agreement. No one's said otherwise so far. And I think the council should support this motion going forward by Councillor Oakes, and I think that the regulation should be tightened up. For the simple reason is, if an operator comes in and has a number of apartments in a building, they have a tenant come in from interstate or overseas, they might stay for a couple of weeks, or a couple of days rather, and then they might cause a lot of damage, a lot of controversy around the building, and then they're gone the next day. And if they realise when they woke up after a drunken stupor, which has happened in my building, simple thing, ring up the bank, I've lost my credit card, that's the end of the story as far as they're concerned. So, you know, no other service department operator pays any extra dollar, not 1 cent, $1 more to or for the upkeep of the building. And that probably concludes what I have to say.
Thank you very much. Is there any questions?
Thank you, Marshall. I have a question. What do you think about the legislation that has come in, like in cities like San Francisco, where they've tried to regulate Airbnb, whereby, my understanding, it's about that owner-occupiers can rent them out for short stay through Airbnb.
Thank you, Kat. We are not against Airbnb. We're not against service apartments, providing they're located in the correct places. I think Airbnb have a place in the community, but it's not in residential buildings. It's not up to long-term residents to have to support the tourist industry in this country, in Melbourne. Like, we're the world's most livable city. We're going to end up the slums in these buildings because I understand what Mr Salter said regarding his organisation, but their rules are meaningless. If we can't, an owners corporation rules can't be upheld in VCAT, he's got no hope of upholding any rules there. So it's got to be a government decision, and we support a 30-day minimum stay in any residential building. And as I said, we don't have any issues with service apartments, Airbnb, but in the correct place, not in our homes. You can't generate a community or do a community in a building when you've got suitcases in and out of the lift all day, people up and down all day, people wandering around wanting to know what they're doing, where they're going. And this happens day in and day out. It doesn't matter how good your operation is, self-regulation does not work.
Thank you. A further question, Councillor Oke?
Thanks for your presentation there, Marshall. I've asked Mr Salter a question about how the coexistence of short-term stay with apartments, because if you think about Airbnb, that's even harder to regulate now, because they're individual owners who decided that if they're going to be away overseas for a period of time, they can put it on Airbnb, and it's even harder. What we have here is an industry that represented by the Victorian Accommodation, AIA, and then you got the Strata Owners Corporation. So we're just what I'm trying to see is how can industry and the owners corporations representing owners within buildings work together to get something that works, because honestly, I support what's been suggested here, what's been put up, because I was in that meeting too. The difficulty for governments, and I look at it now, in some places like the Gold Coast, those tall buildings, 90%, 80% are rented out to short-term stay, because there are very few people who live there permanently. So I can't see that the state government would actually try to regulate something that actually has a national ramification. So the best, I guess, to you is to consider, is there a possibility from your end to work with the other end and come to an agreed code of conduct? That's the question.
No, simple answer is no. If we have a 30-day minimum stay, we're quite happy. But it's not our responsibility to accommodate accommodation in a residential building. Residential means residential, and it's long-term. People that live in those buildings that have to put up with doors banging all hours of the night, all the bad behaviour that comes and goes in these buildings, the suitcases left abandoned in and around the building, contract cleaners coming in and out of the building, no public liability insurance, refuses to provide it. Every contractor comes into my building has to come to my office and sign in, and they've got to state the reason why they're there. The cleaners for the service apartments refuse to do that. So if anyone gets injured, anyone gets hurt, tax, GST is another thing. No GST. You know, when you're turning over $700,000-800,000 a year out of a residential building, who's paying the GST? Service apartment operators are not.
Right, thank you, Marshall. I think we might conclude with that and get on with the notice.
Thank you.
Thank you. I call on Councillor Oke to move a motion with respect to the matter.
Thank you, Deputy Lord Mayor, I moved the recommendation on screen, but with a minor change where I'm requesting the Lord Mayor rather than the planning portfolio. No offence, Ken. To write.
Right. I'm calling for a council to second the motion. Councillor Watts. Speak to it, please, Councillor Oke.
Thank you, Deputy Lord Mayor. I won't speak at length because I know that all councillors will probably want to speak on this motion, and whilst it is under my name, I'd like to acknowledge that that I'm sure any of us could have put this motion forward, but in particular Councillor Watts, Foster, Ong and myself were at the We Live Here forum, and this matter was raised by almost, it was, there were 20 questions. I reckon 18 of the questions were relating to, and that's not to exaggerate, but, a lot of the questions are about short stay and about, regulations with respect to apartments in our city. So, bringing that feedback back to council and having discussions with management where they have been providing our submissions to the reviews that are underway, and I acknowledge that when I wrote this and then when it's been submitted in the intervening time, a bill has actually been put to Parliament, and I've proceeded with the motion, noting that bill might address some of the amenity issues, but it doesn't. We don't necessarily know that, and I think it's important that we still continue to advocate, and that's what we said we'd do at the forum. That whilst we have done a lot of work in this space, we spent a lot of money in the Watergate case trying to get change, and ultimately we're unsuccessful. The community is still looking at council as a means to advocate on their behalf, and this again is one way of doing that. So whilst I acknowledge with respect to the short stay accommodation, there is a bill in Parliament being debated at the moment. It doesn't necessarily address everything, and it's still important that we support management's approaches with respect to their submissions to the review that was undertaken. But importantly, in response to the question that Paul asked me before he made his submission, and I thank you for providing your written submission. Unfortunately, it only came to me very late in the piece, so I haven't had time to actually read it in great length, but I appreciate you responding. But in response to your question, I said that this bill isn't just about short stay accommodation. This is actually about a lot of legislation that needs to be changed so that council is not put in a situation that we're put in too many times with respect to safety, health and safety, owners corporation, regulations that health and wellbeing, the Building Act, Planning and Environment Act. There are a lot of acts that need to be changed with the change of the city, and that a lot of these buildings, need a bit of regulation. It's not about self-regulation at all. We need to have tighter rules and tighter understanding of who's responsible, and it's not good enough that often the responsibility is pushed back to council when it actually needs to be a holistic, whole-of-state approach, and it needs to be undertaken by the state government. And I think that too often in this space it is lacking, and we're put in situations like we have been down at the Lucross building, where City of Melbourne has performed exemplary, in this situation, dealing with the consequences of, I think, poor rules around rooming houses, poor rules around, occupancy, Building Act, Building Code, Owners Corporation. Areas that we have no responsibility for or the ability to change, and yet we are often the ones in that situation dealing with it, and things need to change. And this was an opportunity where we want to support management, we support our officers, support their submissions, not only about short stay, but also about all of these other regulations that need to change. And I think that whilst, yes, there's a bill before Parliament about short stay accommodation, there isn't a bill before Parliament seeking to address all of these other changes. And whilst we're very lucky that we haven't lost people due to these rules not being tight enough, if they aren't changed, unfortunately that might be the case, and I don't want the city, where we don't have the responsibility, to be seen as responsible where we're not. And the people that who are responsible, the state government, need to take ownership and change these rules accordingly. So I said I wasn't going to speak long, and I have, but I'll move the recommendation, and if others don't speak, I can close. But that is the purpose of this motion, and I move it accordingly.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Watts, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yes, I do. Briefly, I'm very pleased that this motion is before us. It's coming directly in response to our constituents at Docklands. I commend the We Live Here group. This is a vexed issue that needs sorting out, and we don't have the capacity to do it, try as we might, at the city. This motion moves to a position where we can advocate on behalf of our constituents, and that is what we are doing. I personally am not convinced self-regulation is working or can work, so I'm very pleased to have an opportunity to put this case to the state government.
Thank you, Councillor. Are there any speakers against the motion? Are there any speakers for the motion?
Yes, Acting Lord Mayor. I'm supporting this motion, understanding that after listening to both the presentations from both the owners, building managers and the operator side, that it is, as suggested by Councillor Watts, it's quite a vexed and a complicated issue. You know, at that forum, we didn't just have Docklands people. We had people from South Bank. We had people from the city as well. I have experienced short-stay apartment poor operators going back to 2009 in La Trobe Street, where we had to work with the building owners to try to do something about those things, because other residents are complaining about in and out movements, and public spaces become private storage spaces, things like that. And I think, as I said, I support this. I still feel that the state government hasn't got the guts to actually do something that has larger ramifications. They will do some things that will address some key issues, and I don't think the owner's side will be totally satisfied, and then the operator side will not be totally satisfied either, because in the end it's a half-pregnant solution. I think while self-regulation has pluses and minuses, it requires both parties to be willing to do things. I know that listening to this, I've been involved from the first day at Watergate when the issues were raised with me, and Council took it up to the VBA, and then VBA came up with orders. It went to VCAT or Supreme Court, and recently Supreme Court even ruled that Airbnb could not be considered as a subletting. So the fighting tools that we have are not a lot. You know, we put this forward to the state government, and I just fear the state government will say, too hard, we'll meddle a bit here and there, and nobody wins out of this. But in the meantime, I still encourage both the industry parties and the owners, managers side to continue to work out some sort of a balance, because okay. Do you want me to repeat that so it gets recorded clearer? Yeah, my accent is a little bit unusual, yes. So I'll leave it on that point, and I support this, but I do encourage both parties to continue the dialogue.
Thank you, Councillor. Are there any other speakers for the motion? Councillor Wood?
Yeah, I'm happy to support this. I agree it's a complex issue, and we don't have all the answers. And further to Councillor Ong's points about Watergate, is not only and Councillor Oke's points about people coming to us and really not having the powers, is that it cost us a bucket load of money, of ratepayer money, to support that case as well. So I think that we do need a clearer set of rules. That comes to the legislation. I think the bill potentially could answer some of these issues. But I think for me, and this is thinking on the run, so I think that this is a good motion in terms of actually prosecuting the case further and doing some deeper thinking about it, because thinking on the run is not a great thing. But for me, having the owner-occupier sort of element to it, at least there's someone that can be held accountable for, even Airbnb or a short stay situation. So to me, that seems to make sense, and I think that if we tighten these rules up and make them really clear for both sides, that in the end, hopefully that's going to make it easier for operators, and certainly the amenity issues for residents, because the thing for me is we've got 80% of residents in the City of Melbourne live in apartments. So this is a massive issue for us, not just from the point of view of being a huge global destination and needing to provide that extra accommodation, which is certainly an issue as well. But that sense of community aspect to it is really important to council for a lot of the other programs that we roll out. So things like waste management, water management, energy reduction programs all rely on a tower where there is a sense of community, because they're the towers that pick this sort of thing up. So we've got to also think about those sorts of issues when we have a sort of revolving door situation where you can't eyeball someone and talk to them about the amenity and that sense of community spirit that's in their apartment tower.
Thank you, Councillor. Is there any other speakers for the motion? Councillor Leppard.
Thank you, Acting Lord Mayor. I support this motion as well. This is obviously an ongoing issue. It predates this and the previous council. I wasn't able to attend the recent We Live Here event, but I went to their previous event where I was lucky enough to be a guest speaker, and I think I had 10 minutes and I spent the whole time trying to list everything that I thought was wrong with the legislative framework for building and planning in the state, and I had to speak so fast that I'm not sure anyone picked up every word I was saying, but it was an interesting experience. The truth is, of course, as we all recognise, that the thrust of building and planning law and ownership law related to building and planning in this state was written before the donut city was reversed, really. The Hoddle Grid, Docklands and South Bank infill of high-density large towers which rely on owners' corps to manage themselves is something that came after the thrust, not all, but the thrust of building and planning law came into place. Now, I think that means that at a state level you've only got 3 lower house seats worth of MPs out of the 88 that really think that this is a very, very high priority. The other 85 probably won't think it's a very, very high priority. That's because it is a phenomenon which particularly affects very high density, large towers where you have owners' corps, and the recent phenomenon of short stay apartments coming more and more into the private realm and away from hotels has just exacerbated that further. So in the grand scheme of things, it's quite a new problem, and state governments across the country are struggling to make sure that their legislation keeps up with that. I think that with the release of the bill that we've been talking about tonight, we can agree, and I think we're about to unanimously agree to the motion, that this state government isn't trying to catch up anywhere near fast enough. And the most important thing about this motion, which Councillor Oke has put in, and I commend her for bringing it to us, is that interrelationship between the Owners Corp Act and the various other legislation. None of those acts were really written with Watergate in mind. They were written with other buildings in mind, and the more and more we see, Watergate style or large apartments built in the inner city at very close to each other, and the longer we take to update the primary and secondary legislation in Victorian law, the more we're going to see those towers being towers full of individuals who are combatant because of the way the legislative framework is set up, rather than being part of a community, which of course is what all towers in the city should be, ideally. So this is a very general motion, but it's a very important one. I think it is very important that the Capital City Council is urging the state government to stop taking such a narrow approach and re-scope this project and do it properly.
Thank you, Councillor. Is there any other speakers? Councillor Beverley-Pindham.
Look, I'm an apartment dweller and I have been for 35 years. I've never had a problem with short stay tenancies. Probably once with a tenant who was a druggie, but close collaboration with the OC and the owner meant that we were able to terminate his tenancy or have an outcome where his tenancy was terminated. So I'm a little bit ambivalent about this motion, but I do concur with Councillor Wood's comments. It's complex, it's also complicated, and I think the more that the Vic AIA and organisations like yours, marshal, talk, collaborate, the better it will be. It needs to be that way, because really there is not a big problem out there. Lacrosse is a huge problem for us, and 3.3 is a critical point that I'll be supporting this motion on. But otherwise, I really, whether you live in a house or an apartment, you can have noisy neighbours, you can have barking dogs, and I just think that it's something where people, if you can communicate and collaborate, much can be done, as has been done in the apartment building that I live in as well. So I will support it, but I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
You, Councillor. Is there any other speaker to the motion? If that's the case, I think we've addressed every part of the issues. I now put the motion to the vote. All those in favour, raise your hands, and it's been passed unanimously. Thank you, councillors.